Hi, I'm Don Jergler, editor of Claims Journal. Thank you for joining us for Claims Journal's inaugural podcast. This regular video series on all things claims related is just one of several ongoing changes here at Claims Journal. We've launched a website redesign, beefed up our coverage of how AI and technology are transforming claims departments around the world, and we're now bringing you a steady stream of expert-written insight on trends and best practices in written and video formats. Stay tuned, there's more to come. Hi, I'm here with Jonathan Porter, Chief Meteorologist at AccuWeather. Our topic is AccuWeather's 2025 Atlantic hurricane season forecast. Thanks for being here, Jonathan.
Don, it's good to be with you today.
So last season was a really busy one, it seemed. We saw 5 hurricane hits. I think Debbie, Beryl, Francine, Helene, and Milton. And 2 were major hurricanes. So this year, AccuWeather is forecasting 3 to 6 direct storm impacts to the U.S. By comparison, are we in for another active year?
Well, Don, it looks that way. And as you mentioned, last year was not only a busy year, as AccuWeather had accurately forecast ahead of other sources. We called last year for a supercharged season, and that is exactly what occurred, and unfortunately had many impacts in the United States, including both at the coast and destruction well inland, as we saw with both Milton and also Helene in particular. The signs for this upcoming hurricane season are for yet another average to above average season in terms of the number of named storms, hurricanes, and also direct U.S. impacts. So I'm afraid we're on the way for yet another active season, which means it's very important for people and businesses to be prepared not only along the coastline, but also in the interior, where we know heavy rain and tornadoes can often be a problem from hurricanes and tropical storms as well.
Well, what areas face the highest risk of direct impacts this year?
Well, one of the things that we do here exclusively at AccuWeather is not only make a forecast of how many storms we're expecting, major hurricanes, but we also forecast the number of direct U.S. impacts. And we also look at which areas of the coastline could be at greater risk for impacts this year. And when we take a look at all of the ocean and atmospheric parameters, and we go back and find years that were similar to identify areas where there can be a greater risk for impacts. And there's a couple of areas that really are highlighted there. One is, of course, across the Carolina coastline, particularly along in North Carolina. And of course, the coast sticks out there along the eastern coast of the United States. And so oftentimes this is a target for tropical storms and hurricanes. This year, there's a pretty strong signal of an even greater risk than the historic average in those areas. The other area that really sticks out once again is along the Gulf Coast, all the way from parts of the upper Texas coast through the Louisiana coastline, and then also the west coast of Florida in particular. These were areas that were hard hit during last year's hurricane season. There were many impacts along the Gulf Coast, so there's concern once again about storms coming up from the Gulf and having an impact not only in the Gulf Coast states, but well inland, especially from a heavy rain perspective. And then you can see there's another cluster from Atlantic Canada to even some storms in similar years that affected parts of the northeastern United States. So people in the northeastern U.S. coastline all the way up through Atlantic Canada also need to be on guard because there can be a bit of a higher risk than the historic average in those areas. And as you mentioned, last year, 6 direct U.S. impacts. They were very significant. The AccuWeather forecast for this year is for 3 to 6 direct U.S. impacts, and the 30-year average, historical average, is 4. So you can see, again, near to above average in terms of the number of direct U.S. impacts. And that is a theme to our forecast here as you look at the different parameters from named storms. We're forecasting 13 to 18 named storms, which is near or above the 30-year historic average of 14. But look at last year, we had 18 named storms. So this year may not be as active in terms of the number of storms, but it still looks like a busy and unfortunately impactful year from a hurricane season perspective.
Well, Colorado State University came out with their initial forecast earlier this month, and I think it seems to be kind of in line with what you're saying. I think they call for 17 named storms and 9 hurricanes, with 4 major hurricanes of at least Category 3. And it looks like AccuWeather is predicting, like you said, 13 to 18 named storms this year. Can you break all that down for us?
Yeah, that and the other sources, as you mentioned, did produce a similar forecast to AccuWeather. AccuWeather issues those forecasts first, so people have more awareness and advance notice of the type of threat that we're expecting this particular hurricane season. Again, near to above average in terms of the number of named storms, and a lot of that's going to do that may be modulated by the status of a couple of factors in the Atlantic Ocean, especially as we make our way through the season. I want to talk about a couple of the factors that lay the scientific groundwork for the forecast that we issued. One of them is we start by taking a look at the ocean temperatures, the sea surface temperatures, and also the water temperatures in the ocean through a depth of the ocean as well. And what we find once again as you look at this graphic is lots of yellows, oranges, and reds. And what that represents is you look at the key, these are places of ocean, part of the ocean temperature where the ocean temperature is between 3 and 10 or even more degrees Fahrenheit above the long-term historic average. And that's a concern once again because it's that warm water that's a fuel for a developing tropical storm and hurricane. And it's also that warm water that enables rapid intensification, which means storms that can gain wind intensity very quickly, 35 miles per hour in 24 hours or less. That's the criteria for rapid intensification. And when storms do that, they not only become more of a problem from a destructive winds perspective, but they also become more of a problem from a rainfall and storm surge perspective as well. So we see, once again, lots of warm water, especially in the main development region of the Atlantic Ocean and in the Gulf. And that is another key thing that we've seen in the last several years. Part of this is the global climate change that's happened, global warming. What ends up happening is that the oceans are a heat sink for the Earth system. So some of that excess heat in the atmosphere is stored in the oceans. And that's one of the reasons that the ocean temperatures in a lot of the world have been running well above the long-term historic averages over the last several years. So warm water again this year, it's not as warm as it was on average at this time last year, but still very warm in many parts of the Atlantic basin. Now, the other factor that we look at is one of the other factors that we look at is the status of El Nino and La Nina, and that is the state of the water temperatures off the Pacific coast of South America, in a particular part of the Pacific Ocean. Whether those temperatures are higher than the historic average, that's an El Nino setup, or lower than the historic average, that's a La Nina setup. And you might say, well, why does that matter? That's all the way in the Pacific, and we're talking about the Atlantic hurricane season. That's because the status of that water actually has a lot to do with the jet stream configuration and other parameters that can dictate how active the hurricane season is in the Atlantic basin. And so when we look at that right now, there has been a La Nina pattern, that is the cooler phase, or the water temperatures below the historic average for some time dating back into last hurricane season. That's moved to more of a neutral phase, and we expect it to be probably a La Nina setup or neutral during the early part of the hurricane season. But look at by the later part of the hurricane season, the risk for a return to more La Nina setup has a greater probability, a greater risk, a greater amount of that pie is taken up by that potential. And so that means that during the hurricane season, it could go from a neutral phase to a neutral phase that might favor La Nina. And again, if that is the case, there could be even more storms than the historic average toward the end of the season. So that plays a big role in that, because when you look at a La Nina setup, you tend to have less activity in the Pacific Ocean in terms of off the coast of Mexico and Baja California in terms of tropical storms and hurricanes, but you have more activity setting up from parts of the Atlantic basin, because there tends to be less of these disruptive winds in the middle and upper parts of the atmosphere, what we call wind shear. There's less wind shear in a La Nina setup, and that can favor more tropical storms and hurricanes to develop. So that is part of the reason that there's that range in our forecast for named storms between 13 and 18, because if we do transition to a more of a La Nina setup toward the end of the hurricane season, that could mean that we could have a pretty active end of the hurricane season, and that would elevate those numbers closer to the numbers that we saw last year. Whereas if the setup remains in a neutral phase, then the numbers could be closer to an average season. So that explains a bit of the variability. But still, once again, you can see the 7 to 10 hurricanes being forecast, which is at or above the historic average there, and 3 to 5 major hurricanes at or above the long-term average in terms of major hurricanes as well. And part of that goes back to that warm water. Warm water favors, in the right atmospheric conditions, favors more intense storms.
I'm gonna get into the whole climate scenario. Like, what indicators do you have? Our readers and our viewers, they love data. So any numbers you got behind all that would be interesting. What numbers are pointing to this? I mean, as far as temperatures, as far as even probabilities, chances of probability.
Well, yeah, it goes back to the fact that those water temperatures, as we mentioned, they are running several degrees above the long-term average, and that is a key setup factor for an active season. Now, one of the other things that we look at, there are a couple other key factors that we also consider as well. One of them is the position of this pretty persistent area of high pressure in the Atlantic Ocean, and that is sort of what we call the Bermuda to Azores high. Why do we call it that, right? Because it tends to span that corridor from Bermuda to the Azores. This is a persistent area of high pressure in the atmosphere. And tropical storms and hurricanes that develop in the Atlantic basin, especially in the main development part of the Atlantic Ocean, way out in the Atlantic Ocean here, their path is often guided by this area of high pressure. If that area of high pressure is set up a little bit further to the east, then that allows these storms to sometimes come up, develop, and recurve, and then they're no threat to land. And in that case, they're a problem, of course, for the marine interests out in the Atlantic, but they're not a land threat. And that's the way that storms, that you can have a pretty active season, but and with many named storms, but not as many U.S. impacts. But a situation where that area of high pressure is a bit stronger and is more oriented closer toward Bermuda, that tends to favor storm tracks that come up and approach the southeastern United States coastline or go into the Caribbean and the Gulf. So this area of high pressure, its strength and intensity does modulate the U.S. impacts, and it is possible to have many named storms but few U.S. impacts if you have a situation where a lot of storms are developing in the main part of the Atlantic Ocean and then recurving, which of course it has a whole different flavor to the season than storms that develop in the Atlantic Ocean and then track toward the United States. And one other thing to point out about the number of named storms, while there's understandably lots of interest in how many named storms there'll be in a particular year, I always point out it just takes one storm to have a really bad hurricane season. Go back to 1992. That was not a very active year in terms of number of storms, but that was the year that produced Hurricane Andrew with all that devastation across South Florida. So this is important to characterize the type of season that is being forecast, but it's important to note it just takes one storm to create a real disaster.
Well, so AccuWeather also believes early tropical development in May is possible due to you say exceptionally warm temperatures across much of the Atlantic basin. Can you go into what that means? I mean, it's early season.
Yeah, early season storms are by definition tropical storms or even hurricanes that end up developing before the official start of the hurricane season on June 1st. And one of the trends that we have observed in recent years and recent decades is a tendency for there to be more of those storms. One of the reasons that has been the case is because of that warm water. And when you are looking for early season storms or storms before the official start of hurricane season, we typically are looking a lot closer to the United States. So we're looking for storm threats that can develop in the Gulf or off the southeastern United States coastline. And look at the water temperatures compared to historic average in those areas. They're reds or oranges, 5 to 8 or even 10 degrees above the long-term historic average. So that's a concern that sometimes at the tail end of a cool front, you can get a quick spin up of a tropical storm to develop close to land. Those are the kinds of things that we start to look for as we head through May and into the first part of June as well. So that's the area that we tend to look at first for those types of storms. Oftentimes they're not necessarily as intense from a wind perspective, but they can still cause wind damage in some cases, but they can be prolific rain producers. And those early season storms are sort of infamous for that kind of a threat. So that's where we look for those early season storms to develop. And then as we get deeper into the heart of the hurricane season, especially as we get into late July, August, and September, that's when our attention typically would be cast toward the main development region of the Atlantic Ocean, where about 80 or 85% of the storms develop that end up becoming tropical storms or hurricanes. Though last year was a notable difference. We had a lot of storms developing in the southern Gulf and much closer into the Caribbean Sea. So it can vary from year to year, but on average, we'll be looking for storms. This is the area that we'll be looking at during the main part of the hurricane season, and that's when you tend to have about 10 or 11 days to watch a storm, sometimes even more, as it develops in the main part of the development region of the Atlantic Ocean, and that traverses to the west.
This has been great, informative, enlightening, all the above, Jonathan. I really appreciate you being here with us. Thank you.
Good to be with you.